No wonder Gormlith looked unwell, Osrith thought. She would know about the Ullaid heard the stories. It would be the younger of the two men who had harassed them that would be her husband. Could she stop it, and help the poor girl? She closed her eyes momentarily. It was too big for her, the diplomacy, the treaty between two long-standing enemies. If she tried, all of this, her battle prowess, her warrior status, her position serving Domhnall, would all disintegrate and diffuse like autumn mist, and she would be treated like any other traitor. She could not bear the look on Domhnall's face if it came to that. "You are coming to Alba with us?" Constantine hissed, as Fergus got to his feet from his position next to tagged on the straw in the last stall, pushing ale towards them. "Yes," hissed back Domhnall, "but as of tonight, I will be acting as if I want nothing at all to do with my cousin's war. I'll be acting my usual self." He drank from the wooden tankard. "I do hope not," Osrith muttered. It came out louder than she expected, and Domhnall turned to look at her, breaking into a grin. He clapped her on the back, and laughed. "The taste of victory," he declared, then smashed his tankard against Constantine's. !inti Slentymuth. Constantine replied, which was echoed by a voice behind them. Domhnall, a grin as wide as Loch Foyle's Bay. Their warriors sat, and drank for a while, exchanging battle stories, gruesome and gory and terrifying. Osrith listened, and added several of her own, including Ragnar and Canute, who may have been defeated by Domhnall's men, or the monks, or may not. She tried to ignore that she had fainted outside the palace, but Domhnall brought it into the conversation, almost deliberately Osrith thought, and she steeled herself not only to take the lily route as soon as ever she could but to be very careful trusting Domhnall. While he may have some respect for her as a warrior, she sensed some resentment, the shame of not being able to punish her by rape Tara, or having to accept her as an equal under Domhnall. Now he decided to join his cousin's cause in Alba and was glad when Constantine changed the conversation. For, by joining with his cousin, he was accepting the unspoken levelness that warriorship brought. He was equal to Taggart and Fergus, and to Osrith. They were unshakably loyal to one another and would go to lengths to protect and help one another, if they were cornered in battle, for example. Perhaps Prince Domhnall was finding equality to Osrith difficult to take. "When do you plan that we leave?" he asked Domhnall. "Imminently. I have had word from Saenid that they seek to retire this season's fighting by Samhain." This was not uncommon. Wars were rarely fought in the winter, but often stretched into November. That Eochaid and Giric had chosen to retire earlier suggested that those loyal to the old king, and to Domhnall, using hit-and-run tactics to deplete them of supplies and resources, were succeeding, and had worn down the king of Strathclyde. Osrith imagined him in his palace in the Green Hollow, where they had sat and been welcomed, before realizing it was a trap, discussing plans, both knowing Domhnall would be coming to reclaim his father's throne, and coming strong and hard in proportion to their treachery. As she listened to the plan, of joining with Saenid and Domhnall's army at Dund, her mind drifted to her brother. She must go with them, back to Pitland, for it would be far easier to get to Wessex on the same land than Irian. And it was at that moment she realized, maybe finding Uhtred was not her main priority. She was a warrior here, she had a lord, and could fight. All memory of Bibbenberg and her flight from Elfric, her uncle, was far from her mind. Would Uhtred even want to know her, or believe she was his sister? And, even then, would Boka force her into a marriage? Her hand reached down to Buoy and made a silent oath on its patterned handle. She was Domhnall's warrior, she had earned her place. She would stand on winter ground and face the Strathclyde Cymric and the Pictish hostile to the Aetildalpin family. For as long as he wanted her, Osrith was Domhnall mac Aetildalpin's warrior. She would not run to Wessex, she would stay by her king's side. 88,888,888. If Osrith had looked up to the sky the next morning, as she rounded the head of land above the Foyle estuary, she would have noticed there was something very wrong with the sun. Drinking had gone on to the early hours of the morning, and stories of war had given way to stories of women they had humped, or would hump, or wanted to hump. Ale then heralded the stories, of the sea told carefully by Taggart, and Fergus recounted a tale from Pitland, of King Bridi's revenge for Osweu's massacre, his trap for the Northumbrian king at Dunnington and deepest Fortriu on the feast day of St. Cede. Osrith knew the story, how her ancestor Ecgfrith's army fought Bridi, who had trapped them on the hill at Nicton, adjacent the loch at Dunacton. Ecgfrith took his army up a hill to fight a Pictish warband, and were trapped with his back to the loch, whereupon Bridi surrounded the hill with the remainder of his army. And Bridi spat at his cousin for the great massacre, Fergus had drawled, raising his tankard, and ran the Anglian bastard through from stomach to spine. Fergus told the story with relish, about Ecgfrith's defeat and rout from the Pictish lands to the River Tweed, while the royals roared with triumph and cheered at the slaughter while teasing Osrith for being an Angle. "My mother was of Cumbraland," Osrith protested, sleepily. "I am not an Angle." "But you are a Northumbrian bratling," Domhnall said, affectionately, and it was he who saw her safe to the kitchens, where she had promised Muir she would always sleep, and it had been before dawn she had risen and carefully taken hot water that the cook was about to use to boil up bones from the recently slaughtered livestock for broth. She had ladled it out into a stoneware jar, dissolving the grated root in it before drinking it down in one go in the corner of the kitchen behind the rush screens that partitioned the kitchens in summer. It was bitter, and Osrith had paused, panting, with the liquid half drunk, before wiping her mouth on her sleeve and swigging the rest. And then, in the darkness she crept past the guards and hurried past the monastery. She needed to be back for the children. She needed to be far away from the palace when it happened. The morning was not a misty one, though it was October. The air was crisp and clear, and, as she trod the sandy track next to the river, it did not occur to Osrith that the sun did not seem to be rising. Low beams of light radiated past her as she stood on the cliff, an hour later, which overlooked Loch Foyle. She should get down there, Osrith thought. She should be near the sea when it happened, so the water could take it all away. The sun's weak rays lit on the stones that acted as a steep path to the beach, and seemed to ooze across the flat, wide strand, as if held back, hindered in its progress. There were no clouds. Add to Osrith's mind, dawn seemed to be getting weaker, not stronger. She stopped and pressed her back against the cliff when she had descending, for an insistent discomfort was increasing and decreasing in a regular pattern around her hips. Osrith breathed deeply. She had wondered about the abortificant, the eradication of the germ of life growing inside her. She had felt no quickening, no evidence of an actual child, and even if she had, she would still have, God help her, done it. Yet, nearly 2 hours after taking it, she'd felt nothing. Until now. Now, the pain was acute, and incessant, causing her to catch her breath and hold on to the cliff wall to brace herself against the pain. Liquid began to ooze down her leg, and it trickled into her boots and onto the sand. It was blood. There was no going back. A sharp pain struck her lower abdomen, and she cried out, gripping at the rock, and she pulled off her boots and breeches, staggering towards the sea. The salt water would help, that she knew, and as the sky grew gradually darker, and the pain grew increasingly intense, Osrith passed blood-streaked matter into the sea, while the ice-cold water stung her legs. Each time the pain came, she was compelled to push against it, each time more furious than the last, until the pain receded, then began again. Each time, Osrith thought she could not bear another. When the pain finally started to diminish, Osrith stretched out in the cold, refreshing water. She felt it cleansing her, refreshing her, and the weak morning sunlight on the ocean seemed to absorb some of its coldness. She looked at the sun's outline, which seemed strange reflected off the blue-green water. When cleansing was replaced by coldness in her arms and legs, Osrith waded out of the water, seaweed clinging to her thigh. What had been most shocking was it was over so quickly, yet the pain, worse than her monthly bleeding, was far less than she had on any battlefield. Using the seaweed, channelwrack and gutweed and a ruck, she began to pack it between her legs so that the viscose fluid which was flowing out of her sore cunt would, with luck, begin to clot before wading back out of the ebbing sea. Shadows were beginning to form, around the rocks from which the moon was pulling the sea, and Osrith sat, knees up and apart, supporting herself on her elbows as she breathed deeply and heavily. It had been a lot of blood, left behind for the sea creatures to eat, a lot of blood and tissue. Yet, what she had produced was not a child, was not a baby. You couldn't be sinful if the child was merely germ, and not formed. Beetha had been right. If she was to be a warrior, and she was, the only path to that was chastity. After a time of staring out to sea thinking of nothing, Osrith realized the pain was increasing again, and she braced herself for it. When it came, a sensation to push came also, and the soft, spongy weed soon became saturated again. Dragging it from her body, Osrith made her way to the shoreline. The tide had gone out a lot further than she thought it would have, and she rolled onto her knees and pulled herself to her feet before loping heavily towards the water's edge and casting the sopping weed as far as she could, before stooping to Lully in her arm and her wrist. How could a germ of life produce so much blood? It was no wonder she had felt exhausted, and she decided to try to steal some meat as soon as she was able, to restore her strength. It will be worth it, she told herself. You are a warrior, Osrith told herself as she scooped up more weed and wrung it between her hands. You can't have a child about you, nor risk birthing one. It was getting difficult to see the weed in her hands as she spat to shape it before pushing it between her legs. Why was it darker than it had been, when it should be getting lighter? She looked up and scanned the sky. No cloud, no mist. But, the shape of the morning sun ... It was not as it should be. It looked as if a small section of it had disappeared. Was this the end of the sun, as Tagged had told, of the sun god Bel destroying the world? She glanced up again. It was clear. The sun had lost a part of itself and the world was darkening. Her instinct was to get to her breeches and boots as soon as possible, to get back to Doir as soon as she could and make pretense that she had merely been searching for the children for their lesson but for the sun. And, in her haste, Osrith realized all too late that she had been followed. Two figures, coming from the cliff path, were heading towards her. There was no mistake that she was their destination, for there was nothing on the strand, such as a fishing boat, and they hurried as she hurried to dress, her gut guessing who they were, and her brain hoping against hope that she was wrong. Osrith took up Buey in her damp, sandy hand. The figure with his index finger missing loomed ahead of his brother, fed a sword held by the other four. King Flann is negotiating a treaty, Osrith blurted out. She nodded in the direction of the younger, black-haired old prince. You are to marry his daughter. She needed to negotiate. Her strength for a fight was low, but she suspected she would have to anyway. Southern Yuan all, spat Nine Fingers. They have their infinite war with Leinster. They do not know that copyright ill. Your ancestors began this war. And, I am going to have my revenge. He raised Fed a sword. Recognize this. Osrith said nothing. She had long given up hope of getting it back, and though it had been her father's, it wasn't hers anymore. She would not waste energy today fighting to reclaim it. Nine Fingers turned to the younger and spat some words towards him which Osrith did not catch. She raised Buey, the blade feeling heavy in her arm as blood seeped down her legs. The copyright hill allowed bees to half-blind our ancestor, King Kongal, Nine Fingers declared. Shall we half-blind you? A voice finished. The younger prince, so fast in his movements, was behind her and had seized her shoulders. I am not copyright ill. Osrith protested. I am, but before she could tell them what she was, Nine Fingers had tackled her to the ground, his long shadow casting towards the east. Osrith fell heavily, the sand was hard and she felt her thighs impact on the sand. You fought with the copyright ill, against the Norse. Osrith screamed in protest, knowing it was in vain. Nine Fingers had a personal vendetta against her. She had lightened him to the sum of one finger. Now, he was going to do the same. The younger prince was already spreading out her right arm, her sword arm, as Nine Fingers sat on her stomach. Pain shot around her hips again as his weight compressed her organs. Eyes, or fingers, he mused, tormentingly, as Osrith writhed under him, and then his hand went to her chest. A look of surprise crossed his features. Then he tore away at her shirt that revealed her breasts. The coldness of the morning took the heat from them and her nipples stood taut against the air. BNUNA tilde copyright ill. Nine Fingers laughed triumphantly. UNA tilde copyright ill woman. Better still. Osrith fought the man's stripping of her, but it was of no use. The younger prince said nothing, but held Osrith's arms down as his brother pulled her legs apart. Osrith protested and writhed her hips. As Nine Fingers found the seaweed absorbing her blood, he made to rub at the bump at the top of her cunt, but when he did so, his hand became coated in viscous redness. Dirty bitch. The prince bellowed in disgust, pushing her legs away and wiping his hand on her leg. He then brought a short knife to her throat. So, you brought on your curse so I would not touch you. Are you a witch? He circled the knife by her throat. I am a witch, Osrith confirmed, the words coming to her lips from nowhere. And I am taking away the very light from the world. She endeavored to strain her head in the direction of the sun. It was getting darker still. Osrith had noticed more of the sun had disappeared. She was terrified, not knowing what would happen if the sun did disappear. But she was not controlling it, and she could guess what would happen if she did not get away from the two allied princes. And all this had not gone unnoticed by a figure at the bottom of the cliff path. She made to pull away at Nine Fingers' confusion, but he wrestled her back to the strand and, grappling at it, he took a handful of sand, forcing it into her mouth. Osrith spluttered as Nine Fingers undid his breeches. Already his cock was erect, its scarlet end shimmering with fluid in the failing light, and he was breathing heavily, anticipating its use. Osrith guessed too, but Nine Fingers had her pressed close to the ground. The younger prince was still pinioning her arms, still silent as he watched his brother. And use it got as he lay over her, forcing his hardness into her mouth, the sand making it raw as he thrust and thrust, like humping, but her mouth instead, his balls hitting her chin. She tried not to gag as the hot end could take the stimulus no more, semen filling her mouth as she tried not to gag as it's spilling down her throat. Finding some air, Osrith bit on his flaccid cock, hard. But, Nine Fingers was off her now, screaming at the pain. His cock limp, still out of his breeches as he hauled her up to her feet. Osrith swallowed as more sand went down her throat and up her nose. She choked. Witch, you are going to die, unless you restore the sun. He grabbed her by her short hair and twisted her head around. Never. Osrith spat back, and Nine Fingers kicked her in the stomach. She fell onto the ground hitting her head. Come on. Nine Fingers growled to his brother. Over there. A shout went up, too far away to be of any help to her, as it ran towards them. Osrith looked past desperately, bitter liquid still dripping from the corner of her mouth as Nine Fingers dragged her by the hair towards the sea. She squirmed and fought, but the younger allied prince drew back his hand and slapped her around the face as she resisted as they dragged her into the cold water. The rock around which Osrith was now being bound had been uncovered as the tide had gone out, but now, as the sun dimmed further, the tide had come back in. Say your curses, witch. Nine Fingers growled, as he threw her against the rock, arms and legs spread back over the rock, her whole body exposed to the air and the sea, which was rising. Osrith screamed. It was clear what was going to happen, and there was nothing she could do about it. She writhed, hoping the rush cords holding her could catch on the roughness of the slate rock stack, to loose her, before the sea came over her body, over her shoulders, over her head. Her scream clearly disturbed the allied, for Nine Fingers took her hair in his hands, smashing her head off the rock. It knocked her out, and when she came to, she saw, through hazy eyes, that someone had buoyed and was fighting someone with it. It was Constantine. In the increasing twilight, he lunged at one of the allied, who dodged and thrust at them. A wind blew around the beach, and, through her injured eye, Osrith gazed to the sky. Only a slim crescent of light was now visible. Constantine, who had now abandoned Buoy, had thrown himself at the younger allied prince. But Nine Fingers was now looking into the heavens. Little by little, the light of the sun diminished. Nine Fingers grabbed his younger brother by the shoulder and they both stumbled away in terror. Osrith opened her mouth and tried to scream, but the cold of the sea had stiffened her body and she gasped against the cold. Constantine loomed towards her, stumbling into the water towards her, but he too looked into the sky. But he plunged on, reaching her. Osrith! He gasped, reaching in near darkness for her hands, trying to find the twine which held her fast. Osrith! Constantine! She managed, her shoulder muscles weak at the strain of her body. As her body grew weak and her leg muscles losing their strength, and then terror struck her. Water was now shoulder height, and Constantine stopped. Around them, the sound of the seabirds diminished, and the whole landscape dropped to an unnatural dormancy. Osrith felt panic rise in her chest, and she tried to scream to him, but the salt water of the sea splashed into her face. Constantine ran through the water, and out onto the beach, glancing at the sky. And, at the moment he reached the shore, the sun was destroyed. Somehow, Osrith found the strength to raise herself up on tiptoe. It was no use, she knew, for the waves were now up to her neck. This was the end. Thoughts of her uncle Ulfric and Bibbenberg, of Pika, comforting her after being in trouble, and of Utad, holding Sobrit's head passed through her mind. When she met God, would she be able to justify her life? Was it worthwhile? The water was close to her ears now, as she stood as tall as she could, head back so her nose was clear to breathe. And, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the sun beamed in one long shaft over the water. Osrith looked up to it. A wave, larger than the last, washed over her head. Osrith swallowed the saline liquid, trying to force her head up over it. It was no use. Memories swirled as the sun shot beams of light all over the northern sea. Under the waves, the black was illuminated before her eyes. Osrith let her body slump, as she inhaled water into her lungs, too weak even to choke. Was this death? Was this the might of the Lord bringing her forth to heaven to make her answer for her misdeeds, before condemning her to Lucifer's fires of hell? Strong arms seized Osrith's arms as her bonds were uncut. The light slowly began to be restored to the world as Domnall MacDuan tilde copyright ill, the exiled prince, carried Osrith out of the water. As the sun recovered its strength, her thin, drowned body held fast to him all the way back to Doia. 88,888,888. What day is it? From a richly lined in a sunlit room, Osrith opened her eyes. For a long time, she looked at the oak beams above the bed, then moved. She wished she hadn't. There wasn't a part of her body that didn't feel in pain, from cracks around her lips to her chest when she breathed. Even blinking was painful. But Osrith moved her head anyway at the sound of a creak of a chair. Domnall Mac leaned towards her. October 24th, if you really want to know, he said. You pupils are missing you terribly. Osrith opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Whether it was because she didn't know what to say, or because she hadn't the energy, she did not know. She closed her eyes, and awoke, after vivid dreams of the sun and an ebbing tide, of a rock and a returning tide, and water over her head. Are you with us? It was Doma again. 27th October, he told Osrith. How do you feel? Glad to be 14, Osrith croaked. Over the next few days she had visitors. The children Domnall, Muir, even Don Chada along with the servants. But not Flancina, and not, noticeably, Constantine. Muir was pleased to hear she wished to resume teaching, and she thanked her for Domnall. He was always the same, bringing home injured animals. Both my boys are the same. She smoothed her blue dress over her small bump. This one too, maybe. While he has a furious side, he equally has a tender one. Then, Muir had leaned forward. Constantine? She asked simply. Osrith didn't need to know the context. It was plain they knew of her loss. I felt pain. I thought to bathe. It was so quick. I will overlook your use heathen medicine, Muir replied. For many a Christian woman has had to respect the old knowledge. When you are ready to be a warrior again, he can see you then. Leaning forward, she whispered, men just don't understand. Constantine certainly didn't. Domnall has spoken to him. I have tried to be chaste, Osrith replied, earnestly. He was just very persuasive. Muir laughed when Osrith nodded. He has a bond with you that cannot be broken. You saved his life. You saved Domnall's against Ivar the Boneless. You saved all of my children Cicero days ago. The house of Atildilpin is pleased to have you amongst its warriors. She leaned forward. My father would be proud that an Angle such as yourself recognized my brother's kindness and have spent the subsequent years in loyal service to his line. And, had he seen any warrior so despoiled by his so-called allies, would have gone to challenge sign A tilde inverted exclamation mark Elmac himself. Oh, don't move, Muir said kindly. All of the warriors, even Don Shada, have begged the king to challenge sign A tilde inverted exclamation mark L, or his sons, for what they did was breaking the truce. Flann agreed with him. But my husband will not allow it, and he will allow Gormlaith, his own daughter, to be married into a family such as would do to her what Nine Fingers had done to her. Was the ceasefire really that significant to the High King? You may resume teaching as soon as you feel well enough, Muir added. The royal children have missed you, and you are to have this. She handed over a sword, much worked, much polished, barely the blade she had won. Astara Buich. Osrith breathed. She was vaguely aware of Constantine using it to fight the allied princes. And then Muir left and she had slept, and Domnall had been to see her, praising her, his warrior still, for her bravery. Those princes will pay, he said, meaningfully. Then, told her they were expecting her in the stables just as soon as she was ready. Constantine too, Domnall added, pointedly. Then lean forward. I hope this has taught you the value of chastity. Yes, my lord, Osrith replied, then added, he likes me to be close, or else, he has been told that I will castrate him if he touches you again, Domnall replied, grimly. And a king in exile does not lightly make threats such as these to his heir. Osrith nodded, gravely. If only they could marry she would be safe from Elfric, and she would always be chaste. But, of course, Eero was to marry Domnall, for succession was all, raise a warrior, build a dynasty, otherwise your throne was in danger. In the end, it was 2 days later, 2 days before Samhain, that she met in Muir's chambers the children. Neil gave Osrith a running hug and wrapped his little arms around her middle. It was quite far from the man as he was supposed to show. Muir chided him, telling his she was in pain after fighting. And we beat the Norse, he replied, happily, before seeing his mother's stern face. Osrith tried not to laugh, laughing hurt, when she saw the knees of his breeches, dirt encrusted, as usual, from his habit of digging through the soil in search of worms or woodlice. But you said, Mary. Neil protested, failing to see where he had erred. We do not greet our injured heroes thus, his mother smiled, for they need to heal. But, yes, Osrith is to commence with your learning. She half expected poor Andra to open the door to them, as she led the royal school across the courtyard, buoy hat hand. Mary smiled at her, pleased to see her, but she could see from her eyes the same expression of emotion that Osrith felt about the family who had adopted her. Had she been in a different place, Osrith's fate might have been hers. Osrith smiled back through her bruised face. She was alive, and she would mend. There was nothing that she couldn't do when she was well, and she intended this to be by her lord's side. The young monk apprentice showed the party into the script room and, once the young boys were busy writing the Gospels out on recycled vellum in charge of the boys, he her to the manuscripts of letters. Clearly it was thought that her habit of viewing the missives was part of what she was there for. We are lucky the Norse did not get here, he said, lifting down the most recent volume for her. All this would have gone. He glanced at her again, and added, I remember you. I was fighting 10 men away. Gosh, he exclaimed. It was a tough section where we were. Our letter from the Lindisfarne monks to those at Iona had made its way there, to Street Combe Sills. It reported the usurper of Bibbenberg had been seen talking to Danes. The usurper, Osrith scoffed. Clearly, the monks at Lindisfarne relied on Elfric and needed his money, so therefore wrote his propaganda. Yet, he was still in league with the Danes, as another letter plaintively put, this time, coming from Chaldees. Bibbenberg's lords supported two brothers with their incursions over the border into southern Pitland. She examined the letter more closely as she followed the words, rereading the horror that had been communicated. Uhtred had stolen the pagan bride, sister of the new king of Cumbraland, a sub-king to these brothers, who was to marry Elfric. He had been punished, though the letter did not say how. Uhtred, not in Wessex anymore, come north to challenge Elfric. Suddenly, her spirits rose. His cause was clearly true. He had never given up his dream of Bibbenberg, and that made Osrith feel a warmth of happiness in her stomach. There were more letters, saying more or less the same thing. News of Northumbria was always hotly received, for it gave an indication of whether lords were plotting expansion into neighboring territories. But Northumbria was ruled by Danes, now. Osrith closed her eyes and imagined the young man who had come to threaten Elfric at Bibbenberg's gates. His features were indistinct, so it was unlikely she would recognize Uhtred on sight. But Osrith was certain she would know him, and a leaving hunger gnawed in her stomach. She wanted to go to him. After all, the loyalty to her lord was not enough alone. All would be right when Osrith had found Uhtred. 8,888,888. They were returning to Alba on the same night as they had left, All Saints' Day. That was the next day. Samhain, that day, would come and go, in a faithful marking of harvest offered to the dead, silent dinner, and doors locked and double-locked. Osrith made her way over to the stables that night. After bidding a farewell to the children, she had grown fond of them, especially little Neil and the capable, forthright Mary, and suspected she may have to leave without notice when they crossed the sea to restore Domhnall to the thrones of the Ge'ez and the Picts, to Cobtin Ysanid Mac Alpin's line, to be the first king of all Alba. She had gone that evening to the stables, and was grateful that no fuss had been made of her return.